Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tsemberis. I first became aware of Dr. Tsemberis while writing a college research paper in a way back when time I won't mention on housing and homelessness, and that paper was specifically about the Housing First model developed by Dr. Tsemberis at Pathways to Housing in New York City versus the kind of housing readiness approach where folks need to kind of hit certain key milestones in order to be determined worthy or ready for a housing opportunity. At the time, I was interning at a homeless shelter and was continuously encountering barriers when I was trying to assist my clients find their housing options. Dr. Tsemberis has truly had a remarkable career, and in fact, last month's Time magazine featured Dr. Tsemberis as one of the 100 most influential people in 2024. And I couldn't agree more with how Time magazine put it. Quote, his model, Housing First, has changed the lives of tens of thousands of people and is influencing policies in cities across the US and the world. By treating housing as a basic human right, Sam demonstrated that leading with humanity is the most effective way to ending homelessness. This plenary is sponsored by Providence St. Patrick Hospital, and we'd like to thank them for their support of the conference this year, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Tsemberis.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be here in Montana. It's my first time. It takes a little used to getting fresh air and things like that. I live in Los Angeles, so if I'm not quite coherent, it's because I've been breathing unfamiliar air particles. There's no soot. See, my presentation today is about Housing First, and it's been around a while, and it's about what Housing First is and what Housing First is not. And also, are there some useful things that we have learned that could apply here to this community? How many people work directly in homeless services? Right. And how many people work in housing development and housing finance? And yes, okay, thank you. I was listening yesterday, and that was sort of my read of the room. I just wanted to make sure that I got it roughly right. Let's see. Oh, the monitor's right here. Okay. So this is what I plan to say, and I'm going to leave a few minutes at the end if you have questions. But I'm basically going to describe what the program is, and I have to do that by also contrasting it to what it's not and what we've been working with primarily, and still the predominant model, what I call traditional services, is what drives homeless services in this country and Europe and other places. How the program works, a little bit about its effectiveness, a little bit about research effectiveness, something that's not very often done in homeless programs, and then next steps and how can we use Housing First, either the program or the program principles, to address homelessness, especially chronic homelessness in our community. What is the Housing First program? It's basically a permanent supportive housing program. I know that term's used a lot because it describes different structures. Most frequently, permanent supportive housing describes one building with services on site, and the people living in the building are people who have been identified as homeless and are benefiting from a either project-based or tenant-based voucher with support services on site. The Pathways Housing First program that I'm describing uses what's called in the business a scattered site model, that it's not one building. People rent apartments from community landlords or public housing authorities, and there's a deliberate effort to have integration of people of all kinds in terms of their demographics. Certainly their finances are on the affordable housing side, so this is all about affordable housing, but it's not a building that's just for people who are homeless. We try, when we're working with community landlords, to rent no more than 10 or 20% of the units in a building. So it has a housing component, typically funded by a voucher or some other permanent rent subsidy. And it has a social services or support services component. It's those two components that are sort of the structural elements of Housing First. And there's a program philosophy which is different than traditional medical model prescriptive philosophies. It's a ground-up approach that is defined by what we call client-driven or consumer-driven practices, where the people you're working with are working with the provider in partnership in terms of developing plans that affect their lives. So it's those three components that are the program. Okay. Just to kind of step back a little bit and say that, and I'm sure everybody knows this already, homelessness is a growth industry in America. I mean, if it was something on the market and we had invested in it 20, 30 years ago, we would have done as well, if not better, than we would have done by investing in real estate. I mean, it's just going up every year that we count it, and we count it annually. And the demographics look the same. It's mostly men, about 70%. Of course, minority groups, African Americans, Latinx, and indigenous people are overrepresented. Youth leaving care, and 7% veterans. But that number is slowly going down. In the last 10 years, it's been reduced by half, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But the reason I show you this, and the reason I show you this map, is that this map shows you density of where homelessness is. And it's not evenly distributed, as you can see, throughout the country. It's particularly more prevalent on the coasts, from Seattle down to San Diego and from Cambridge intermittently down to Miami. But the middle of the country, except for Texas and Colorado, are not as intensely affected, although here in Missoula and in Montana in general, you are going from that kind of light blue approaching dark blue because progress brings homelessness. My presentation is not about overall homelessness, although I think that the implications of some of the program principles apply to everyone who's homeless. My main focus is for the group that's down there at the bottom of that pyramid, the 10 to 20% of people who are homeless and remain homeless for a year or more, or the way HUD defines it, because that's the group that has not been able to exit homelessness. Most people who become homeless resolve homelessness on their own. About 60 or 70% are homeless somewhere around a month or 2, 3, and they resolve it. So get a job, somebody helps them out, but they don't touch even the homeless service system. They're not recorded by HMIS and all of that. So why do we keep having the same numbers of people are resolving homelessness? And this is I think, something that is maybe counterintuitive, and we don't talk about it this way. Homelessness is not the same population. The people we counted last year are not the same as the people we count this year. There is a perpetual flow into homelessness and a perpetual exit out of homelessness all the time. All these people that are coming in and out, the people that stay are the people who are chronically homeless. They stay much, much longer, years. I mean, from 1 to 25 years. But this other group is flowing in and out of homelessness. And that has implications also for how do we address this. If it's not the same people, you know, if we don't stop the flow, no matter how good we become at ending homelessness here, if we end all homelessness in Missoula today, Next year, around this time, we'll have just about half as many people. In 2 years, we'll have the same number again, because if there's no prevention, people will trickle into homelessness. The group that is chronically homeless, though, gets a lot of attention because they are the most visible. They are the people that everybody sees, and most of the programs we have set up since the beginning of this period of homelessness, which really has only been, it's not been forever, it's been 40 years, but still we're treating it as an emergency. And the service system we have set up, the homeless industrial complex, consists of a lot of emergency programs, shelters, transitional outreach teams, and in an effort thinking that this is just something temporary and we're going to fix it. And today, nationally, we spend $10.7 billion on the shelter industry. And that's only the industry that we have data for. There's a lot of private industry, faith-based shelters that we don't know. But we do know from what we have on record that only about half of the shelter beds are filled on any particular night. So that it's not the most appealing service. There's other emergency food, pantry, clothing, other programs like that on the charitable side, charity programs, helping those who are unfortunate. There's also enforcement programs. The police, depending on the municipality, are more or less aggressive in their arrests for people who are homeless, trespassing, drinking in public. Very easy to arrest people who are homeless or give them a citation, which they can't afford to pay, and then they get arrested and go through criminal justice. Then they have a record, and then when they're applying to Cheryl for Section 8, they're disqualified. So there's also involuntary commitment efforts, the belief that people with mental illness don't know what's good for them, or people with addiction don't know what's good for them, and we need to intervene involuntarily, which is true. I mean, if someone is severely mentally ill and a danger to themselves or others, like it would be for any of us, we would be taken to the hospital for our own good and for the safety of those around us. But these laws that are being perpetuated are way beyond that in terms of the extension of involuntary commitment. Without any housing as a remedy, by the way, people go into the hospital, they stay 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or more, and then they're discharged back into homelessness, and that's how it goes round and round. That's where I learned about homelessness. I was an outreach worker in New York City. I was directing a program called Project Help, which was an emergency psychiatric outreach team, taking people to the hospital, Bellevue Hospital, involuntarily, for their own good, we thought, hoped. We didn't always agree, but it was a difficult decision, and often because they had a medical problem, their feet were swollen outside their shoes, or people were coughing up blood, we knew that at least they would get medical attention, and they did. And 28 days later, they would be back on the same intersection with the same shopping bag that they had brought into the hospital with them. And this, what they call institutional circuit, which I worked in for about 4 years. I'm not a quick learner, but I get there eventually. I thought we had to do something else. We had to do something else. And what was it? We didn't really have a plan B. And the staircase is a graphic that sort of represents, I think, the difficulty of getting from the streets to a place of your own, because the whole system is set up with the belief that people with mental illness and addiction, this chronic group that I'm talking about, need to first cure their or get control of their mental illness and addiction before they can be housed, that they couldn't possibly manage housing with these issues. And so our traditional service system, I would call shorthand either the staircase or a treatment first, then housing model. And that's okay. I mean, it worked for a bunch of people, 30%, 40%, we never saw again. But what about the others? And we had no plan B. Our plan B was created out of desperation. We sought advice from the group at Boston University. They were doing psychosocial rehabilitation, they called it. And it was the idea that we could think about mental illness and addiction, by the way, in a different way. Like, not to cure it necessarily, but how do we have people who have these conditions, which can be long and maybe even lifelong in some cases, have a life of meaning? I mean, many people struggle with chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, but people have a job, they have families, and is there a way that we can bring this approach, this psychiatric rehabilitation approach, to homelessness, and especially for people with mental illness on the street? And that was the plan. And to see how it worked was actually quite disruptive to everything we knew, because before this plan, people had to follow the steps. You go from outreach to shelter to transition, and now we were going to the street, and with this new approach, we were going to ask the person what it is that they wanted. Clearly, what we thought was good for them wasn't taking us where we wanted to go. And we thought, well, let's ask them. Maybe they have some ideas about what their life would be like. And so when we would say, would you like to go to the hospital and get some treatment? So, no, but you're hearing voices. Just, yeah, I've been hearing voices a long time. I don't pay attention anymore. And what about the addiction? I've been drinking since high school. That's not my problem. Well, how can I help you? I need a place to live. Isn't it obvious? I mean, it was extremely obvious, but it was so out of our realm of possibility. So in order to deliver on that promise, we're going to help you with whatever it is you wanted, we started this thing that we initially called the apartment program, because everybody wanted a place of their own, just a small, modest place like they had before they were homeless. They were not particularly interested in going to programs that were identified as programs for the homeless mentally ill. They didn't want to be identified as living in there, because even though the buildings had no sign on them, everybody in the neighborhood knew it was that building. So people wanted just the kind of anonymity and the comfort of just being part of the community like they were before. I would say that for us, that changed the way we were thinking about programs and how to deliver services in a very radical way. Thinking about, can we go from running programs that are designed to change people to operating programs that work to serve the person, rather than changing the person to fit the program, changing the program to fit the person. What would that look like? We didn't have a bunch of resources, but it turns out you can do a lot of change, and you can do things very differently if you take a different philosophical approach, even with the existing resources. The program has 5 components. I'm not going to describe it here in detail. There's a workshop after this talk that I'll be happy to answer any questions specifically about the operation of the program. But rather than assessment, so these are the principles. Consumer choice is at the foundation of it. I would say this whole thing, this whole Housing First movement, has really started in a way that other social movements have, from the people that are most affected by it is the thing that we're trying to solve. I mean, it's really a program that was designed by people who are homeless, and I think one of the reasons it works so well is that, you have a focus group, you ask people what they want, and you give it to them, and they're participating in it happily, willingly, not with coercion, not with mandates. Choice is foundational to it, and participation in nothing about us without us is one of the mantras of the consumer movement, in fact. Separation of housing and services means that our commitment as a program is to the person, not to the housing. So that if somebody loses their housing, we still stay with them and help them find another place or move to something that's more to their skill set or to their ability to succeed. So the commitment is to people, not to the units. Services must match people's needs, means that we don't provide, the traditional mental health and addiction, although if people want that, of course we do. We'll drive people to the benefits office or to their doctor's appointments or help them grocery shop or whatever, they're like the things that people actually need. And recovery-focused and community integration I'll talk about later. So fundamentally, I would say that even though it's called Housing First, the program is not about housing first. It's about developing a relationship with the person you're working with first. It's people first. By the way, it wasn't my idea to call this thing Housing First. People would come and see us and want to visit the program, and we're explaining what we're doing. We used to call it the apartment program because we used to give people apartments. And people said, well, when's the treatment? I said, well, the treatment comes after they're housed. Oh, I see. So you do it backwards. You do like the housing first. So, yeah, and so it kind of was a shorthand way of describing it. It seemed useful. Anyway, it begins with a relationship with the person and a commitment to help them in the way that they want. Choice in housing is, of course, limited by the constraints of the real estate market, what vouchers will pay, and all of the other things that we know. But even within those restraints, a choice between units, having the person have a say-so, do you want this place? Typically, people from the street will say they'll take the first place that they want it. But it's different when you're asking as opposed to assigning or placing. There's a different sense of ownership and participation, and that creates much better success because people feel like they're choosing their home. They haven't been put into it. The separation I've mentioned, which also includes not only losing the apartment, but if people are hospitalized or incarcerated, we meet them at discharge, and if it's not been too long, they go back to the same place or we find them a new one. And it doesn't always work on the first try. Sometimes you have to have a disaster to learn that you can't really invite all your friends over because the landlord will evict you, and then the second time you learn maybe to be more selective about how you manage the unit. It's a painful and expensive lesson, but we haven't figured out quite a shortcut for it yet and still stay true to the principles. Fortunately, and why the program does work, is that the disasters of tenancy violations essentially are relatively small given the success rate. Variety of services, very important. Not to be underestimated in terms of the creativity and resourcefulness that's needed by staff to have an authentic, helpful relationship with the person. I mean, one way I have to say of maybe describing this, because we're sort of in a professional setting with the context of program language. But if we just took all of that away for just a second and thought that if we had a relative who was unfortunate, was struggling with some issues and became homeless, I think each and every one of us would know exactly what to do and how to take care of them. And we would never discharge them. We would never be disrespectful to them and insist that they do this before that. We would work with them and help them get the help that they needed. I mean, it's totally intuitive. It's just somehow the program language and all the rules get in the way of that very simple way, that sort of humanity that binds us all. And if we thought of people that were serving as our relatives, you wouldn't really need a lot of training, actually, to figure out what to do. You know from your heart what to do. And I think that that's sort of the essence of the program. Like, we take care of people like they're our people, they're us. So then you don't get into, is this Medicaid reimbursable? One of the most frequently misunderstood things about Housing First is that it's just about the housing. It's housing. You put someone into housing. I heard of Housing First. You put someone into housing, you know, no pre-treatment requirements. That's true. But there are requirements, and the requirements have to do with the lease. People have to be able to manage the terms and conditions of a standard lease, and also they have to agree to a home visit. This is where most programs get it wrong, and even the present guidance from HUD is incorrect. They talk about services are optional. No, services are not optional. Treatment is optional. You don't have to be sober to get an apartment. You don't have to be totally sane to get an apartment. I mean, who of us is? We'd all be homeless if we had to live to those criteria. But you do have to agree to a home visit. We're not going to put someone in an apartment and leave them there, especially from this chronic group that has a lot of issues, and not go visit. The visit is negotiated up front, and it's mandatory, and we will visit as frequently as the person needs to be seen. That's not an option. So that's where HUD, I think, has in some way contributed to the distortion of what Housing First is. They've misunderstood this issue of no treatment requirements and then made it to no service requirements. And now when people go knock on the door and the person says, no, I got a place, I'm good, you know, like people don't come back, and then things don't go well. The service support piece, I mean, giving the housing right away is huge, and of course, it's the most important engagement piece. But keeping the housing sustainability is only possible because of the service support, and the service support must be there. Here's the trick, here's the challenge. You're hiring people that are supposed to be good at helping people, and the client knows there's a home visit, but they have a lot of rights because they have tenant rights. They can not be home if you visit, if you're not getting along. So the onus of making these visits happen is not on the client to be compliant, it's on the staff to figure out a way to have a relationship with the client so that their clients are happy to see them. Can't be that hard if you've just given the person an apartment. You know, you start out with a huge bunch of chips that people should be happy to see you. So we hold the staff accountable for making the home visits happen. But they must happen. And that's where all the work comes in. I mean, you know, everything is all about getting people housed, but to help people recover and to really have a life, the conversations that take place in the apartments, the care, the encouragement, things can be better. People move in and they feel like, I'm good, you know, they've been living in hellish conditions, and that's all they can do for now, and they don't want to do the next thing. Other people in a couple of weeks want, I got to see my relatives, I haven't even contacted them, they've been hiding in shame and homelessness. Other people want work, other people want treatment. Whatever it is, we keep going and offering the kinds of support that they need. So that's what Housing First is, and you know, I'll say more about it in the workshop. I'm going to move to the issue of working with property landlords, because this is, there's no clock, right? Oh, thank you. And thank you very much. I have to move quickly, is what the clock tells me. All right. Working with landlords is a huge part of it. I've only been talking about the client and the case management, but every team should have somebody you call a housing specialist or a property landlord liaison person, someone that you're asking landlords, think about it, permanent supportive housing, very supervised, 24 hours, staff on site, that's one model for permanent supportive housing. Then this other scattered site model, an apartment in the community with a landlord that's not there very often, that's it. You know, where are the services? And so if the landlord is having an issue, there's no staff on site, we need to support that landlord if they're going to work with us and take clients that are higher risk than the usual clients that they can get for those units. And that's an investment of resources, which has a lot. You won't succeed in this program unless you can do landlord engagement properly. You need to be able to have someone the landlord can call around the clock, just like there is for the clients, a 7/24 on-call service. You need to be responsive. Every problem can't be solved, but it can be addressed. If the landlord feels they're not alone in this, they will continue to work with you. If your landlord calls you and says, hey, I got a unit, you have another client that you want to house, you know you've succeeded in establishing the kind of relationship that you need to start building a landlord network. Another strategy we've used is master leasing units. Because of people's background, it's been difficult, in credit history and everything else. So the agency leases the unit. It's sometimes a building. And it's a very, very practical strategy and very, very useful in negotiating exits and entrances without having to go the term of the lease, and you control also who goes into the unit because the background checks are waived because the agency is now on the lease rather than the tenant. Many, many advantages. Other incentives for landlords: damage mitigation fund, vacancy mitigation fund, mutual lease termination. You want to do everything you can to negotiate either a termination or a move rather than an eviction. You don't want people having eviction on their records. And direct access to someone on the staff that the landlord can reach. If the program is operated properly, and this is what program fidelity is about, there's like a 40-item checklist about how you offer the housing, how you provide the services, how your team operates and manages all of that. If you do it correctly, there's a lot of evidence in this program. This program has been studied in randomized controlled trials, which are pretty unusual for a social services study. But the initial trial showed an 84% housing retention rate using Housing First over a 3-year period, I believe that shows, versus a 35% housing retention rate for standard treatment. So it's not just a little bit better than standard treatment, it's at least twice as good as standard treatment. It's a huge difference in the number of days, months, and years people spend housed as opposed to homeless. Probably the single best example in this country of a Housing First implementation at large scale is the HUD-VASH program. How many people have heard of HUD-VASH? Oh, yeah, good. So HUD-VASH, as you know, 56% reduction from 75,000 down to 35 or so, and still being driven down as more vouchers and more cities are using the HUD-VASH program, based entirely on Housing First principles. Over 100 cities now have ended veterans' homelessness. When people can't be managed in the apartments and you're having repeated relocations, at some point you can't be doing the same thing. Otherwise you're doing the same thing at that sort of institutional circuit. You've got to have a different model in mind, and I think that the permanent supportive housing single-site model, supervised, is a great companion to the apartment scattered site model. Because, either, directly, some people might want to live in a building that's supervised because they're often in much better shape than the rental. But most people choose the scattered site. But if they don't succeed after a certain point, choice has to be restricted to, you can take this or nothing. We're not going to try this again now for the nth time. And N is defined by the degree of hope for change that the program has for the person. Could be 3, could be 7, could be, whatever you decide. It depends a lot on the relationship. So Housing First, not only home services, One of the things that often comes up, I just heard this in another city, we tried housing first here, it didn't work. Well, how did you do it? Well, we had this building downtown. It was like a hotel. We renovated into these small studios, put everybody in the hotel that was like the most frequent users of police stations, addiction and treatments. And we had one case manager there from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And the place was a disaster. The police were there more than the case manager. And it's like, so we tried that housing first thing. It didn't work here. Is that housing first really? And the extent to which you don't do the program fidelity is the extent to which your housing retention rate is going to be affected. If you do it poorly, you're not going to get the 80 or 90% housing retention rate that we know this program can deliver. Another myth about, I think, it's not about housing first, but about homelessness in general, is that it's only about people who are homeless, and that's just not the case. It affects all of us. Let's just revisit for a moment this map. And there's this excellent book by Greg Colburn and Clayton Aldrin, 2022, called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And what they looked at national data, national Medicaid data for treatment of mental illness and addiction. And they looked at housing, homelessness, rental across the country. And they were trying to correlate homelessness with the things that we typically believe, mental illness and addiction. Well, there's like somewhere between 14 and 16 million people receiving treatment for severe addiction and mental illness in this country. Only about 1 million are homeless, 563,000 actually. There's no correlation between mental illness and addiction. It turns out, just like we know from our families and friends, that people with severe mental illness and addiction can live at home if they have families and friends and resources to do that. In fact, the majority of people with these conditions do live at home. So this idea that we have this industry that looks to treat these in order to get people housing ready is just not founded on facts. The only thing that significantly predicted homelessness in their national study was the price of rent and the degree of rent burden that it has on the person on a monthly basis. So you can imagine high rent areas, the only income the person has is either general assistance or an SSI check. There's no way that if they become homeless, that they're ever going to find their way into homelessness. So he likens it to a game of musical chairs where, there's 10 chairs and 11 people, and then the music stops and one person doesn't get a chair, and that person typically, has a physical disability or a orientation problem. They're not moving as quickly, and then that person is out. And you think, oh, this person, because something about them. No, it's not about them. It's just that we took away one of the chairs. And so it's the lack of housing that's creating homelessness, and most vulnerable are the people with co-occurring conditions. So this would be, another way of thinking about ending homelessness, continuing to do what you're doing and working hard to build the kind of supported housing that changed the rental vacancy rate from 1% to 6% here, and continuing along those paths so everyone gets a shot at an apartment first, and then they could go to more supervised settings rather than investing all of this money in emergency and treatment and then housing. We could do a lot better with an investment in the other direction. Milwaukee did this in 2018 to 2022, and they reduced the number of people who were chronically homeless on the streets from 317 to 17 in 4 years. They had the DA and the courts adjudicate criminal records. They had a resident council made up of people who were formerly homeless. They had the whole community buy into this approach. So the police were not arresting people, they were calling the Housing First team. The business community was calling outreach rather than the police. The outreach team was tied to the housing authority directly, and the housing authority was putting a priority on housing people who were chronically homeless, keeping the long waiting list, but adding another prioritization so that vouchers, people who were chronically homeless waiting 6.5 years would be dead by the time their name got called. So you need a different entrance or access to those vouchers for a group that's that vulnerable. But the entire community changed their approach and working, and that's what created the reduction in a city much bigger than Missoula, and certainly be implemented here, I think, quite effectively. Thank you. I ran over a little. We have a couple of, yeah.
Do you have time for just one or two questions? I'll take one right here.
Hi, I'm Amy Hall from Montana Legal Services in Helena, and I'm wondering what prompted Milwaukee to do that amazing advocacy and community approach to solving homelessness, and whether it related to Matt Desmond's book, which publicly shamed Milwaukee so badly, and their treatment of homeless people.
Well, that's very interesting. I have to look at the dates of the publication, but I can tell you that I don't think it was the book. It was the county executive, like the trio of county executives that we had here. And here's the takeaway in terms of like this kind of idea of introducing new programs to a new community. The ones that have been most successful, like Hudvash, Milwaukee, Houston, have all been led by government. Because you need government resources in order to put in place and fill all the gaps that you currently don't have. The county executive didn't know exactly what they wanted. If he was going to take a stand on homelessness, he wanted to know that they were going to do something effective so that it wouldn't be a liability. Most politicians don't want to touch the issue because they feel it's a no-win. But he hired the director of the housing authority, this guy Jim Mathy, who had worked on an ACT team, was familiar with Housing First. I went in, talked, made the plan, and the implementation was done. County executive support to the mayor's support, housing authority leadership. Housing authority had its own outreach team, sort of circumnavigated all the coordinated entry and all of the barriers to housing that we've put in place. And so they had that kind of direct approach, had quick success early on, and then the business community joined, the DA, the courts. When people saw movement, it built a momentum.
Question.
Yeah, can you speak to sort of the implementation of the distributed model, the multi-site model, especially with supply challenges in the market?
I'm sorry.
So how were you able to identify landlords and lease opportunities in markets that have tighter supply challenges?
Oh, I don't think the approach is any different. I think that you could start with landlords that are already working with Section 8. You could start with, you'd have to, there's already a demographic, in every community. You're going to look at the map of where the housing stock is. And it's almost like, I don't know, people don't do this anymore, but you go door to door selling encyclopedias, But it's networking. There's landlord associations. The word, flyers, information about guaranteed rent, all the mitigation, damage mitigation, sort of the program advertises itself quite well. And one thing I didn't mention, but I think is also useful, when landlords do participate, to have an annual recognition at their own meeting or a community newsletter, something where people feel like they're participating not just in being a landlord, but in solving a social problem that matters to everybody. That's the thing about this thing. It matters to everybody. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tsemberis.